In this segment, we're going to show you how to create a logic extension. Again, we are creating a logic extension to update the delivery date. So we log into the Orchestrator Studio and we select logic extensions. After that, we then want to create a new one. So we click there and we are now in the application to create or modify logic extensions. We're going to call this update delivery date. And then we're going to set the features of this to do the functionality that's needed. I've given it a name. We can add a description to it. Now this is going to sound kind of generic, the description, but specifically we want to do this to update the delivery date on a purchase order, but this same functionality, this same logic extension could be used in other applications, could be used in the sales order, could be used in work order, anything where there's dates where you can use one date to update the other. So that's why it doesn't have to be a delivery date that gets updated, is my point. But in this particular, and that's what we're doing in this particular case, but this could be reused later on to update other dates. Okay, let's move forward. First thing we want to do is add items to the data structure. The data structure is the interface you could think of as between this logic extension and the application that it's going to. So whatever is going into the logic extension, whatever is going out of the logic extension needs to be defined in the data structure. You have a couple of ways you can define the data structure. In this case, in order to keep things simple, we're just going to use data dictionary items. So I will add one, and we're going to add the requested date, which is again what it's going to be based on. And it's important before you get to this point that you've done a little bit of homework and you know what aliases or fields you need to use in order to set this thing up. That way you can go through this pretty quickly. In this case, I know that the requested date has this alias. It's nice that it's the same, but really what's important is that it is a data dictionary item for a date field, because the system doesn't really care what the field is labeled for or what other uses it might have. It's really important that it's the right type of field. If you want to input a date, you don't want to use a text field or a numeric field or something like that. This has to be a date field. Okay, and so drqj, I'm adding it, and it's date requested, so that is convenient that it's already labeled that way. That's an advantage of knowing that ahead of time. But if we wanted to, we could go in and modify how this is labeled. In this case, I don't think it's needed. Let's go on. That's going to be the input, the source. In other words, we're going to update the promised delivery date based on this requested date. So we need to add the promised delivery date, and we need to add a field for the number of days to add. So let's do the number of days next. And again, that would be a data dictionary. And in this case, it's really an example of what I was saying before. This is really, as long as it's you want to add the right type of field. In this case, we want an integer. We don't want somebody to type in fractions because we want to add a certain number of days. So I'm going to use a standard integer field, int01. I'll add that. And it has the label integer01, which is not terribly informative. So let's change that to days to add. And you'll notice that both of these are input fields, which is exactly what we want them to be. And that's what's checked by default. So far, that's okay. The next one is going to be the output. Once we have the date, the requested date, and the number of days to add, we need to do the math and then output the new date to the application. So we need to add one more item to the data structure. So let's do that one more time. And in this particular case, I'm going to use promise date alias PDDJ, which, as you know from JD Edwards, some date fields are used in lots of different places, so they're not always labeled the way exactly you would expect. We don't really want to call it the scheduled pick date. We want to call it the promise date. We can go in here and update this. And this is not an input field, this is output. No one's going to be putting into it, only the logic extension itself is going to be calculating it. So you have the option, as you may have seen, that it could be both input and output, or just one or the other only. And in this case, there's no reason for it to be anything else than what we've selected here. So we've created the data structure, which is the interface points for what's going in and what's coming out. The next thing we need to do is go to the logic of the application. And what I did here was click on the logic icon, and it shows a graphic example of how the logic extension is going to work. So what we need to do now is add an assignment. And you can either click here and click plus, or you can click up here. Let's go down here and click on assignment. This is where we're going to assign the new value to the date we want updated. So let's go into the assignments, and it's going to ask what's the target and what is it that you want to update. In this case, it's the promise date, and you'll see it's labeled to help make things simple. It's kind of obvious in this case, but if you get into more complicated ones, this can be very helpful. But the arrow shows you that it's an output only field. So promise date, how is it going to be calculated? What's the source? The source is going to be a date function. We're going to add dates to a particular field. Well, which field do we want to add it to? We want to add it to the requested date field. And what days do we want to add? That's the other element in our data structure. Notice if you click here, this will show you all your choices of data structure items. If you needed to use a variable or something else, you would click here or some of these other fields. But again, we're doing a very simple example to get you familiar with it. Once you are familiar with it, you can explore the other features and capabilities. So we'll add the days to add, and we are basically done. So this says that we start here, and promise date is calculated based on adding the number of days to add to the requested date, and that determines the new promise date. Essentially, you're done here, but something I would suggest strongly that you do is to test what you've done. You can do that here before you ever attach it to the application. So let's do that. And on this icon here, that looks kind of like a beaker, I guess, it's where you can do a test. And much more complicated logic extensions where you're calling business functions or doing much more complex things, adding arrays or other things like that, this becomes more important. This is pretty simple. Maybe you wouldn't need to test it, but it's always a good idea to do that. So let's do it. So here we have a layout of the data of the data structure so that you can see what's going on. Now, we're not in the application we need to be in, so we're going to have to give it an example date because it's not pulling it directly from the purchase order. This is a test. And let's say we want to add 3 days to it. And then we want to test to see if it runs. You can click run to test it, and you can see that the 7th of January plus 3 days becomes the 10th of January. So our application is functioning correctly. The next step we would need to do would be to attach it to the application that needs the updated dates. But before we go there, let me cover one other thing briefly. If you have a much more complicated logic extension, you'd want to run it in diagnostic mode. What that does for you is allow you to step through each step. And again, there's really only one step in this one, but you could have a dozen or more steps, and this allows you to see the values of each of your variables or other fields as you go one step at a time. But in this case, I think we're all good. We don't need to do that. The next thing we want to do is attach this to the application.